There's been some recent studies that have shown that as many as 89% of people worldwide want meaningful climate action. That's a huge number. So I think that's very hopeful. It's just comes back to talking about it more. I think you feel less alone when you talk to other people about it. And I think you'll be surprised by how many other people feel similarly or want to do something, but maybe just don't know where to start.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, community, and business. And today I'm so pleased we have Bridget Shirvell, who is a journalist, author of Parenting in a Climate Crisis, guidebook for raising emotionally resilient, climate-literate children in a warming world. And the goal of our conversation today is to explore raising resilience and parenting in the age of climate change. Bridget, thank you so much for joining us. Your book blends personal experience with science and journalism. What led you to focus on parenting through the climate lens?
Thank you so much for having me. I think what led me to really focus on parenting through the climate lens was the birth of my own child in 2018. I had always been involved in environmental issues and environmental reporting in my journalism work, but I was focused a little more on the food system. And then after the birth of my daughter, I started to think more broadly of just all the different ways climate change is going to be affecting our lives, and really what does that mean for individuals. There's only so much you can do as an individual person, but when you have a child, like, how can you raise them so that you'll be able to help them live in the world that they're going to be inheriting?
Thanks for sharing that our environment, a time of our life tends to shape events, or events, tend to shape our understanding or the choice that we make. So
Right.
that's so nice to hear. So how did concerns about the planet impact your decision to become a mom?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that that's an issue that a lot of people are struggling with, that I get a lot of questions from people who are like, should I have kids? Should I not have kids? It wasn't something that I thought about as like a deciding factor, which maybe was a little selfish of me, but I always knew that I wanted to be a mom. So I definitely have concerns about how my child will feel as she gets older and understands the state of climate change. But it wasn't something that was really a deciding factor. And, one of the things that I think a lot about is it would also be a little selfish of me to not have a child because of the climate change, just because it's kind of like thinking that I can predict the future. And I think that none of us can predict the future. And I'm much more focused on how I kind of create joy for my family and how I, help my child live in this world.
It's a difficult question nonetheless. Perhaps I should have given the context that I'm a dad, a father, and yeah, some of these I find not just this discussion, but in sustainability, there is a danger or a trap of choosing binary, either left or right, or black or white. But as we probably aware about life, where it's not as straightforward as it is, and perhaps this is where our discussion is unpacking some of these
Right.
very difficult questions and topics, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah. So no, thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah,
go
there's
on.
a lot of nuance, I think, to any kind of climate or environmental issue, especially like on an individual level.
Yes. Yes. So what fears or questions did you have when you were imagining your child's future?
So I think initially the fears I had were very kind of focused almost on like her college age and beyond. Like, would she be able to even go to college, or would we be like living in a world where, there is so much wildfire smoke from different places where it just like wasn't safe to be outside for long periods of time. So that was probably really my like initial fears, were a little more long term, focused around air quality and even food production. A lot of my reporting has shown that we know soil degradation is going to like affect our ability to farm. But I think more recently, my fears have kind of been about the day to day, just because I think we're seeing everything speed up so much in terms of the climate change effects. You know, when my daughter graduated from preschool, so they had a nice little ceremony. That was a couple of years ago. When here on the east coast of the US where I live, we had all this wildfire smoke coming in from Canada. And so I made her wear a mask to her preschool graduation. And that wasn't something that I was expecting. I thought that I would have had a lot more time to kind of have to start having these conversations about what's happening to the planet and, you know, why we have to do certain things.
What I'm curious and excited about your book is if I look on one scale where you have a number of leaders or board where they have to make choices, which is 20 years, which quite frankly, no one can predict about life. Those decisions, which is 20 years, people making those decisions probably have 5 or 10 years left in their career. And so it becomes difficult for them to look that long term. And we know we all have our own motivations, right? So on the other side, you have for children, I believe they have a huge opportunity to understand some of these things by the time they become the decision makers or start to make impact. Then, they've had a good understanding or appreciation of some of these. So I'm curious to know how you see that as an opportunity in some way for children, even though, yes, there are climate issues. Perhaps we can start with the opportunity it may or may not bring with starting early conversations with your book about the climate change for children.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I also think about it a little bit more for, I guess, parents of like young children, because I think, especially maybe when your kids, or depending on like where you live and what your options are, but especially when your kids kind of hit that like school age, you really, as a parent, start thinking about like, well, what type of school do I want them to go to? Like, what do those options look like? And right from there, you're starting to think about like their long-term options. And so that's something that kind of gives, I guess, parents and kids an opportunity to start thinking about, well, what is going to happen in 20 years? What are kind of like the values that I want to instill? And so that's kind of where I think about it. And then on a child level, I think, you know, you can start setting the groundwork very easily or very early for a love of nature. And that kind of can open up to discussions about all different other things, how we think about energy, where we get our energy supply from, how we get our food, you know, who produces our food. It kind of sets the groundwork for thinking about a lot of different sustainability issues.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So, how do you recommend parents process their own, this time, eco anxiety while still showing up emotionally for their kids?
I think it really depends on the individual scenario, right? I'm going to use, I guess, the wildfires that happened out in LA at the beginning of this year kind of as an example. I, you know, live on the other side of the country from that, so I wasn't directly involved, but I remember just feeling very, very angry, like angry that people were dealing with that, angry that we were still here, angry that nothing had kind of changed. And I had to really think through my emotions and how I was feeling about them before I could talk to my child about what was happening out there and kind of explain it to her in a way that was like age appropriate. She's 6, right? So explaining why these fires happen, why they're scary, why, you know, I'm upset about them, but in a way that also didn't make her needlessly upset about them. So I focused a lot for her on like what the people out there were doing. She, you know, at 6 is very concerned about animals. So she wanted to know if the animals were safe. And so we had conversations about how certain people were trying to save animals. And so I think it's just very much you have to think through your own emotions before you can kind of start to focus on your child.
I know understanding society, relationship, but I'm curious to know what has psychologists taught you about how children actually interpret climate threats and vulnerabilities.
I mean, it totally depends on the age of the child, but for young children, especially, it's very personal, right? So, like, for instance, my child was very concerned about the animals, but for other people, if you have grandparents that maybe live someplace where there are hurricanes, they're going to be very focused on them and what that means for their grandparents. Kids are also, of course, very worried at a young age of, oh, like, is that storm going to come here? Is that fire going to come here? So they're very much focused on what's going to impact them at a young age. And then I think as you get older and they get more aware of what else is happening on the world, teenagers feel much more anxiety about the overall state of the planet and what's happening to it and what that means for their future.
I'm sure parents have to find ways to have conversations about their children on a number of topics, but I'm curious to know around the climate crisis, when and how should we start talking to kids around the climate issues?
That's a great question. I don't think that there's really like any one age. You can start very, very early by kind of setting the groundwork, not for talking about the climate crisis, but for things like respect for nature, right? When you're like outside at a park or wherever, why you don't, leave trash around, for instance, or like why you don't like pull all the branches off of a tree or something like that. You can talk about it very much in a way, like just like you want your kids to clean up at home, right? And turn off lights or pick up their toys. You can kind of set those same type of things when you're outside. And that over time can like start having bigger conversations around, okay, well, we're trying to protect the grass or the flowers because the bees need them and we need the bees because they help give us food. And then there are these other things that are potentially harming the bees. And it kind of like all goes into one after the other. So that's something that people can do very early on. Of course, as your kids like get older, they're likely seeing things on the news or they're hearing things at school. And so then that, something to have start having conversations about what are greenhouse gases and how do they work. Lots of people like to use kind of the blanket analogy because I think that's something that kids, when they're like, say, 7, 8, 9, can understand, where you can talk about how it's almost like there's a blanket around the earth and the blanket keeps our planet to be a good temperature that we can live on it. But when we do certain things like burn fossil fuels, it's almost like you have too many blankets on yourself and you're getting too hot, and that's hard. So I think that can be a very visual experience and physical, right? If you can put a bunch of blankets around them and kind of demonstrate how they feel.
I don't know if research supports this with children generally at a young age are more action driven, perhaps less fear. There are more solutions. So, for example, if you talk about the animal situation where they are more likely, again, I'm making big assumptions here, and see whether you found any of those when you're writing a book where they're more likely to look at, okay, how can we protect the animals or how can we find solutions? Perhaps give you a context. I've discovered that one of the big challenges for companies and leaders, society, governments not taking action with the climate change is there is a lot of communicating about what they are doing, signaling what they are doing, but less actually taking actions which delivers impact. So that's what I'm curious to know, whether that gives hope with the children or is not any part as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think children tend to be very empathetic, right? And they're also very like, this is good or this is bad or like, this is fair, right? Their fairness is a big thing for young kids. Like, they have two cookies and I only had one. That's not like fair. So I think in some ways, climate solutions are kind of easier almost for them because they don't potentially see all the other problems with certain things. It's, you know, people should have electric cars because electric cars are better for the planet, but they don't like have a grasp of like the finances involved in that or like where you charge the car if you don't have access to that. So in some ways, I think kids are more solution oriented. And I think that is something that can be hopeful, especially when you focus it on things that they can do. One of the students I talked to, because I talked to some kids in my book, and he started, I think, at the age of 12, kind of doing river cleanups in his hometown. And that was something that like he could do that made a difference, that made him feel like he was taking solutions and gave him some hope.
Give us an example of an age appropriate conversation that can build awareness without causing fear.
Yeah. So my child is 6, and we talk a lot about single-use plastics, because especially once your kids start school and they have snacks or like they need a water bottle, right? So we talk a lot about, I want you to have a reusable water bottle because it's better for the planet. You're not throwing things in the trash, but it's also better for you because there's not plastic coming off of it. And then, like, I have talked a little bit about how that plastic is like a byproduct of fossil fuels, which she is like familiar with now. So she kind of knows that like that is one more thing that can kind of like harm the earth. We talk a little bit, I guess, about just like she gets sick, right? All kids get sick. They understand what that means and they understand that there are things that they can do to make them feel better. So I kind of have talked a lot a bit about that. Like the earth is a little sick, but there are things that we can do to make it feel better.
That's a very good example around the single use plastics. You emphasize empowering kids to take action, which we've discussed just a minute or so ago about how I believe they have a huge potential to take action compared to the inaction, which has happened from the leadership or those who have to take action space. But I'm curious to know how empowering kids to take action is crucial for their mental health.
Yeah, I think taking action for kids for their mental health is just like gives you, it makes you feel like you're doing something. And sometimes that's on a really small scale, but sometimes it's setting the stage for bigger actions. Some of the students I talked to in the book, had convinced their schools to install solar panels. And that was a huge, like year-long project that they did in high school. And it wasn't easy. They had to go back and forth. They had some like rejections and then had to present more information and explain how it made sense budget wise for the school board. They had to get signatures. They had to talk to all these different people in their community. And that just helps them also build more community, help them build resilience. And all of those things are helpful for your mental health.
Talking about schools is probably a good area to explore a bit more. What are some real life strategies that educators and parents can collaborate, partner to raise climate literate, hopeful children?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is great for elementary schools is things around food and waste because those are kind of very accessible. So I know some schools have composting programs and some you can do it at your house too. And that, makes kids start to think about what they're wasting, but also what happens to that waste. And it's kind of fun for kids, especially if you have like a worm composting system, right? So that's kind of getting them out there to start like doing some things and then kind of opens it up to have all these other conversations. I know, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, some places have done kind of waste audits with the kids. So they'll have them go through like their trash and think about how they could reduce that trash. Like, for instance, if you have small yogurt containers, could you buy a bigger yogurt container? Or if you're always wasting bananas, you're not eating them before they get too ripe, like what else could you do? Could you buy less? It's all these sort of like problem solving skills that kids can learn from a young age through environmental issues.
That's very good opportunities right there. Now, there is an area where it's a very difficult part where the amount of greenhouse gas emissions on an individual basis or in a household is small compared to what companies are releasing. So, how do you encourage or navigate that challenge where people might say, yes, you may be reducing your own carbon footprint at home or seeking for perfectionism, but how do they navigate around it doesn't become or fall into guilt or perfectionism, which so I'm curious to know how families, parents can navigate that core challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a tricky balance, right? There's a lot of research that has taken place that actually has found that individuals have the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 27%, which is huge by kind of making 6 shifts in their day-to-day lives. So it's some things like buying less clothing or keeping electronics for, I think, an average of 7 years. So it's those are focused very much around consumerism and consuming less. But we know that that can be really hard and you're not going to get it perfect all the time. So I think it's kind of figuring out what you can do in this stage of your life and also just giving yourself grace when you can't do things right all the time, right? Like sometimes we're out somewhere and we've forgotten our reusable water bottles or our reusable drink cups, or we're someplace that doesn't like allow you to use those. So we get the plastic throwaway container because that's the only option. And even when you're doing something like that, which my daughter now will like point out of, oh, we're not being a very good friend to the earth today, we kind of talk about why that's okay, but also like why that's bad from a systems point of view and what we can kind of do as individuals to hopefully nudge the system to be a little bit better.
If you seek for the perfectionism, it might cause some fundamental disappointment, but perhaps progress is very important. So, talking about the overconsumption, where a lot of industries, businesses have built their model, manufacturers have built their model to get people carry on buying for the next new phone, the next new car, the next new clothing, and so on. Sometimes, perhaps I'll use a very poor analogy where you have a leaking pipe where you come and you mop the water, but the actual solution is to go and close the tap, the source of that leak of water. So I'm curious to know how there are any practical steps families can take to break that cycle of overconsumption, which has become part of the recent culture.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard, especially because you can get almost anything you want, like shipped to your door with the click of a button, right? So it's like one of those things that you've had a tough day and you want that like instant feeling of, oh, this feels better. And sometimes you turn to buying something for it. It's taken a lot of time because you do kind of have to like train yourself, but I very much try to think of, do I really need this item? And is there another way for me to get it besides buying it? So I have like, it's something where I reach out to people I know, especially people with like older kids to say, oh, hey, like, do you have rain boots in this size by chance that you still have that your kids have outgrown that like Charlotte can have? Or like, do you have this thing that we borrowed a life jacket once for a weekend because we were going to a lake instead of like buying a new life jacket, right? We just could find one from a friend's that we could use for a little bit. So it's things like that, but it does take some time to kind of train yourself to think about those questions first. With my own child, she's an age where she like sees things that other kids have and kind of wants everything. So I think I try to ask her a lot, okay, well, do we know how that this thing was made? Do we think it's good for you? Do we think it's good for the planet? Do we think it's good for the people who made it? And I kind of try to get her to think more about those questions. And again, like kids are empathetic and they're very fair when they're little. So it's kind of easy for her to see, oh, like, I don't actually think I really want that, or maybe that's not the best thing for me to have.
Exploring how to have good conversations that has empathy, how discussions around these changes around the climate impact, the biodiversity. What is the role of effective storytelling and conversation in driving this? You mentioned a few about behavior change in driving this cultural shift within families, but also within communities.
Yeah, I think that for individuals, when I was doing the research for my book, what the experts with climatologists and psychologists kept coming back for was that we need to talk about climate change more. And I, to be honest, didn't really love that advice. I was kind of like, but that's not action. Like, I want people to act. But their thought very much was that we don't talk about it enough and people are very concerned about it, but we feel kind of like we're alone because nobody's talking about it. So I think that storytelling is very powerful in terms of kind of creating systematic change or even just change within your own community. But I think you have to make it very personal. So instead of coming at it from more facts, science based, it can be something as simple as like, I've been really struggling with what to make for dinner. Do you have any tips? But oh, I've been trying to focus more on plant-based meals and like this is why. Or, I'm find that what happened in the LA wildfires, going back to that, was really, really scary. And I'm worried about my kids' future. And what do you think about that? Just kind of like really making it emotion driven instead of fact based.
This is not within the remit of your book, but I'm curious to know if you have any advice for startups or companies who are building, for example, a plant-based burger or an alternative solutions. But for example, is a plant-based burger, but still maintain the taste. So if you're asking people to switch from what their taste buds have been used to, perhaps our ancestors or the lineage have been used to, which gets passed on from an evolution perspective. So when alternative solutions are being built by companies or startups, how they can consider key aspects so that the switch into these alternatives to help the climate change impact gets more buy-in or more uptake, which helps the whole ecosystem. Hopefully, the question was
Yeah.
clear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, no matter what kind of product you're creating, you have to make it very easy for people, or kind of to make it that it's not a big change. It's something that they probably are already doing. For instance, I have switched from using like plastic Ziploc bags to like the reusable like stasher bags that are silicone based, right? So it's not as much waste. It's a material that has a slightly lower carbon emission overall. And so that's something that is easy to do because it was something that I already used. It was just like a little bit of a change. Same with things like I have compostable like cling wrap because instead of like using saran wrap. And so that's like a product that a lot of people already use, but here was a better alternative or one that, you can compost in your kitchen. So I think things that are kind of built into people's routines already, but just takes like a little bit of a switch.
Yeah, that's good. So, Bridget, what gives you hope when you think about the next generation growing up in this climate era?
I think one of the things that I found really hopeful recently is just the number of high school kids and college students that I've seen kind of putting on their own climate conferences. Over the past like 3 or 4 months, there's been things like that happening all over the United States. And I think that's been really great to see. And they've been kind of focusing it more on an individual, like what individuals can do. And some of that is just like in light of current US politics that it makes more sense to focus on individuals instead of systematic change. But the fact that they're so invested and kind of still moving forward, I find really hope.
You have the current political climate, but we know governments do change from time to time. But what is a good stakeholder are customers, which we all are, investors and the community. So, what hope perhaps can you give to the parents or listeners out there, irrespective of what the climate condition would be, whether it's the left or the right? But the momentum can still go on. Hopefully, you can share some hope for them as well.
Yeah, I think there's been some recent studies that have shown that as many as 89% of people worldwide want meaningful climate action. That's a huge number. So I think that's very hopeful. It's just comes back to talking about it more. Like, I think you feel less alone when you talk to other people about it. And I think you'll be surprised by how many other people feel similarly or want to do something, but maybe just don't know where to start.
What is your final thought, Bridget, to the audience, please?
My final thought, I guess, is just to, pick something small that you think you can do and just start doing it and don't worry about being perfect all the time.
A huge thank you to Bridget for sharing these incredible insights, talking about the book, some practical aspects, some conversations, and the hope that it brings, some key collaborations, and a whole lot more.
Thank you.
Listeners, yeah, if listeners want to find more about your work, Bridget, where can they find you?
Of course. So I have a website, brieshirvell.com, where you can find links to the book, other writing, my newsletter.
I'll put a link of that in the description. So thank you once again.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.